Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. This week in Illinois in Focus, we'll discuss the corruption trial of longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, whose fate is now in the hands of jurors. We'll also talk about the potential for ethics reform in Springfield in light of all the evidence presented at Madigan's trial. And we'll discuss the ongoing raids by the federal government searching for criminal illegal immigrants during the early days of the Trump administration. All that and more when we come back with Illinois in Focus.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. As we record this on Thursday, January 30th, jurors are deliberating the fate of longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and co-defendant Michael McLean. Madigan has pleaded not guilty to 23 corruption-related charges. Federal prosecutors allege that Madigan used his power in state government to steer no-work or little-work jobs to his close allies in exchange for passing legislation favorable to the bottom lines of ComEd and AT&T Illinois, and also steering work to his private Chicago law firm. Joining me to discuss this is our man in the courthouse, reporter James Telemani. Jim, before jurors were handed the case, defense attorneys delivered their closing arguments, and the prosecution presented its final rebuttal. Tell us about the prosecutor's final remarks to jurors.
It was dramatic, Dan. I have to tell you, and it was the closing arguments were long. I mean, they went longer than the attorneys estimated on both sides. And after this, we had one last day of closing arguments, or the rebuttal case by the prosecutors, and it was Assistant U.S. Attorney Amar Bachu who handled it. I talked with Patrick Collins, who prosecuted the George Ryan case years ago, and he said, well, really, Bachu's the architect of this case. He, as much as anyone, built it, so it's appropriate that he would do the rebuttal, and he was pretty strong, both substance-wise, in terms of going through the law, going through each count of the indictment. It's a long case, and we've been going since early October, and the jury's had to digest so much, but he was able to break down the law, I think, more concisely than either the other prosecutors or the defense attorneys for both Madigan and McLean. And he did it with a lot of impact. He said Madigan and McLean, there was definitely an argument from Madigan's side that, well, Madigan didn't know what McLean was doing. He wasn't aware that his precinct captain was getting these payments. And Bachu, broke that down, I thought, pretty well. And he said these guys, referring to Madigan and McLean, they weren't playing checkers. They were playing chess. They were grand masters of corruption. And that line kind of, you could just feel the impact of that. And even after the break, after the jury was out of the courtroom and had been dismissed, one of the defense attorneys said, grand masters of corruption. Well, almost as if to say, I don't know that anyone, saw that coming, and it was, even though that's not a legal part of the count, it was impactful. And then in describing former state rep Eddie Acevedo, who was testified at one point, but he had his own tax issues that he was convicted of a few years ago. But related to this case, he was getting payments from ComEd and AT&T, according to the government, for little or no work. In the case of AT&T, no work. He wanted more money than he was being offered, and he let out a stream of expletives with his response to AT&T. Blank you, AT&T. Well, Bachu repeated that line dramatically in the courtroom and then went on to say essentially what Acevedo and the defendants were saying to all of us, the people of Illinois, and how Madigan abused the public trust. And he closed by using a letter that McLean wrote to Madigan when McLean told him he was retiring, about how he was standing with his musket, always ready to defend the speaker, and how the speaker had his hand on the rudder. And Bachu said, this was absolutely true. He had his rudder on the ship of the state of Illinois. Essentially, I paraphrase what Bachu said there, and he said, "It's up to you, to the jury, to essentially to restore that sunken trust that was abused by Madigan and McLean." So it was quite a day, and I think at the end of it, everyone was the jury wanted to go home at 4:30 instead of 5. I think they were probably spent at that point. So they only had about an hour of deliberations, and they had a couple of notes to the judge, actually 3 notes in that time. And they were instructed by the judge to select a foreperson. So I'm guessing they just kind of did that and some basic housekeeping stuff, and didn't even probably get down to breaking down these counts. So it was quite a day. It was dramatic. It could go either way. It's in the hands of the jury. We just don't know what's going to happen.
Right. Jim, throughout the trial, which you've been covering since day one, you've also talked to legal experts, lawyers, former prosecutors who have nothing to do with this case to just get their opinions about it. They've all said that the government faces the burden of proof, that they need to get unanimous verdicts on each and every single count. What's your take on all that?
It's complicated. And, as I mentioned Patrick Collins, who prosecuted the George Ryan case. So there's this mountain of evidence. But, this isn't like there was a congressman from Louisiana, Jefferson, that they found cash in his freezer. In other cases, there's been cash under the bed. There's nothing like that here. There isn't a video of Madigan saying, we're going to bribe this, or we're going to take bribes to. So there's nothing that's a slam dunk moment. But there are some key pieces of evidence, and one of them both Collins brought up with me, and also I talked to defense attorney Sam Adams Jr. for the other side of this. He defended Rod Blagojevich, former Illinois governor, in his first corruption trial. Remember, there were 2 for Blagojevich because there was a mistrial, or a partial mistrial. He went 2 rounds, Blagojevich did. But and they both pointed to a piece of evidence that was not admitted at the start of the trial. It was rejected by Judge John Robert Blakey, whose father wrote the RICO statutes. In other words, these bribery laws, these were written in 1970, and he was the principal person who drafted these statutes. So Judge Blakey is probably as familiar with these laws as any judge in the country, one would think. And he certainly seemed to be very, very familiar, because he corrected attorneys several times, especially defense attorneys, on the law. And what they talked about with this is how the this piece of evidence wasn't admitted, but then Madigan, when he testified, said he expected people to do work, and he opened up this opportunity for the government to introduce a recording that previously hadn't been admitted. So the government, after Madigan testified, asked for this to be admitted. Defense objected, overruled by Judge Blakey. So this piece of evidence came in a recording where Madigan says some of these guys are making out like bandits. Now, it wasn't admitted at first because this was referring to another ComEd hire, a former union executive, ally of Madigan's. But this was not part of this. That wasn't part of this. This happened, I think, just before the period considered here, that hiring. So that particular alleged bribe, if you will, wasn't part of the charges here. And of course, a lot of people would say, well, this is all focused mainly between 2010 and 2019. When Madigan was in office, he was speaker starting in 1983. So this isn't affecting anything that may have been going on. This trial isn't about things that were happening in the 80s and 90s, or even the early 2000s. So, but this recording was allowed where Madigan says some of these guys are making out like bandits. And then McLean says, oh my God, and for very little work too. Boom. So there you have this piece of evidence that, again, and the defense attorneys, when this was admitted, the jury was not in the courtroom when it was the judge agreed to admit it, and you could see at Madigan's table, not Madigan himself, his expression didn't change really, but and certainly Dan Collins, who's I think been kind of as this has gone on, really been the lead guy for Madigan's team of 5 leading attorneys, who knows how many behind that, and he just looked crestfallen, and there was clear, like, okay, this is a problem, that now the jury's going to hear him say these guys are making out like bandits. And of course that was replayed in prosecutors' closing arguments, and then Bachu yesterday displayed the transcript again just to make sure everyone has that in their minds, the jurors do.
So as I said up top, we are recording this on Thursday, January 30th. As you mentioned, Jim, this case started in October. Mounds of witness testimony to go through, dozens and dozens and dozens of witnesses who have testified. More than 200 secret recordings that were played in court. They've got a lot to go through. We fully expect this is not the type of case where a jury is going to be back in an hour with unanimous verdict, but it could happen Friday. It could be bumped into next week. Do you have any expectations? I know I'm asking you to speculate here, Jim. How long do you think this jury could go?
Well, it's a great question. It would be, like I said, if it happens really quickly, like over a period of a few hours or even one day, you have to immediately think something's wrong here. And I'm sure the defense will be ready to protest any kind of situation that might come up, or if things don't go their way, to eventually use that in some kind of appeal setting. But the judge let the jury decide. They hadn't been meeting on Fridays, and he said, normally we do during deliberations, but it's now your case. It's up to you. And they said, we'll come in Friday a little bit later, 9:30 instead of 9. I don't know what time maybe they'll try to exit early too. So I don't know how much they're going to get through. You just have to think with A, the complexity, and B, the number of counts. 23 counts against Madigan. Only 6 of those include McLean, but it's not just these counts have, it's not just count 1, then count 2. It's count 1, A, B, C. There are a lot of things to consider. And as you said, so much evidence, so many witnesses, many, of course, former state reps, a current sitting U.S. Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski testified, a sitting appellate judge, Dave Ellis, who was Madigan's chief counsel. It was in Madigan's office as counsel 3 separate times, then went straight to being an appeals court judge. So many twists and turns and ways that you see the Madigan influence throughout state government, also city government, his role in dealings with aldermen and county officials. It's just and not all of those things pertain specifically to the counts, but there's just so much to go through. And the law, the judge's instructions were, there were, I believe, more than 70 and over 100 pages of instructions. And so they're going to have to refer to these instructions when considering whether laws were broken or not. So it just, the judge has been very complimentary of this jury, how diligent they've been, how, they've been almost always on time. Rarely is anyone late. If they are, it's a few minutes. So he's been really complimentary of this jury. So they may move a little better than a normal jury would. He said at one point, best jury in 30 years or something like that. But maybe he says that every case. I don't know. I doubt it. But I would have to think, just given the complexity and the volume of material, that it's going to take some time.
And Jim, you will be at the courthouse waiting for that verdict, waiting for jury deliberation, something like election night. You've got people who vote, the polls close, and then for journalists, it's hurry up and wait for the vote counts to come back in. This essentially for you is going to be a hurry up and wait type of thing, because we have no idea when the jury's going to come back.
And the judge told all the parties involved, be within 15 minutes of the courthouse. So he doesn't mess around. He doesn't take these 2-hour lunches like some judges do. It's an hour, and he wants everyone close. It's not be within an hour of the courthouse. It's be within 15 minutes. And so, yeah, it's one thing. It's exactly that. It's like an election night where you have, it's election day. It's so exciting. Then you wait and you wait and you wait. And sometimes you wait a long time. So same thing here. We'll get advisories. There's one member of the media who's been selected to kind of advise us when there's going to be a note. And so he'll come back into the court. Everyone comes back within 15 minutes. He reads the juror's note. There was only housekeeping stuff on Wednesday, but it's going to be just that. And then, after this period of waiting and what could, if it lasts a while, turn into kind of a boring period of time, then all of a sudden, boom, everyone's in the courtroom, all these counts are read, and then the flurry of activity after, when the parties come down for, their meetings with media, which is in one designated spot on the first floor of the courthouse in a lobby. It's not an ideal setting, but so it's kind of a pack mentality in this little area, and then that's it. And then everyone has to get their work done. And then now, if there's a guilty verdict, this isn't over, because then the judge said, and again, this, and some judges would push this back for weeks. There's the forfeiture bench trial. So in other words, when you start talking about the defendants potentially forfeiting funds and that kind of thing, that kicks in next. And then obviously sentencing would be at some date down the road. But just, again, the way Judge Blakey seems to operate, he might not push that as far down the road as we've seen in some other cases.
Jim, segueing just a bit here, for years, Republicans in Springfield, Republican state lawmakers have called for ethics reforms to try and prevent the same kind of allegations that we're seeing in the Madigan corruption trial. And for years, Democrats have been resistant. They passed some token reforms, etc., but nothing really substantial. This year, current legislative session, which is underway in Springfield, there are some Democrats who are calling for ethics reforms. State Representative Eva Dina Delgado, in fact, said she's expressed optimism about ethics reform. Do you think, in light of all of the evidence, regardless of the verdict, remember, it's got to be unanimous. All 12 jurors have to agree on every count. So we just don't, that's a tough task to get, regardless of the verdict. Do you think ethics reform will be a meaningful part of this legislative session in Springfield?
Boy, it's hard to say. Now, Governor Pritzker, his side is, well, we've already passed ethics reform, but most of your legal analysts and reform advocates said, well, this has been, really minor. Even former Governor Pat Quinn, he's one Democrat who has advocated, and especially, in the last year or so, he has said we need an ethics initiative where voters can put a measure on the ballot, put ethics measures on the ballot, directly affecting their elected officials. And he cited Ohio, Michigan, and Missouri as states right around us that have these ethics measures in place. Most of the Democrats have been kind of, well, yes, we need, we want ethics, we want accountability. But as far as specific measures, there hasn't been a whole lot of support building. And even Dina Delgado, when I talked to her, she was definitely said it's a new day. We have a lot of new members. I think things can move forward. She seemed very positive minded toward what I mentioned, former Governor Quinn. But as far as she didn't give specifics about legislation, I didn't sense she would. I haven't checked with the trial going on checked legislation in the last week or so to see if any Democrats have filed anything. Obviously, Republicans, have been filing things every year, but, if there isn't Democratic support, it's simply not going to move. And so my sense is when we get a verdict, either way, but especially if there's a conviction, you'll see immediately Republicans will have all kinds of statements about this. This is why we need ethics reform. And inevitably, there will be pushback. If Republicans go one way, Democrats probably going to go the other. And ultimately, I think also, the governor, if he's not publicly or privately having some willingness to support ethics reform, it's hard to see it happening. So there will be calls for it. I suspect there will be some Democrats who will be, there are some Democrats who have, especially in the later years of Madigan's speakership, once some of the allegations came out regarding some of his aides who stood up and opposed him, there wasn't a whole lot of opposition before that. But some of those reps who've been in since that time may join an ethics effort, but it almost has to come from them, because if it's coming from a Republican, it's just given the nature of things, especially now with Republicans in control in Washington, there's just immediate, you sense it now from every one of Governor Pritzker's press conference, there's going to be some, whatever he's announcing, there's going to be part of his press conference that's going right after Donald Trump. That's just, so, so for lawmakers in Illinois, in his party, to not kind of join that, it is not easy. So because in essence, he's not perhaps at the power level that Madigan was at in terms of controlling all kinds of, but he is, I don't think anyone could argue, he's the most powerful Democrat now in the state, just given both his position and his financial, right, his strong finances. So it there may be, but it's hard until there's some concrete legislation or a statement from the governor or Speaker Welch. But again, Speaker Welch was essentially selected by who? Mike Madigan. So then there are a lot of Democrats in the State House and the General Assembly who were Madigan allies, who, if they weren't strong supporters, they were at least going along with his agendas during those years. So I don't know how much pushback. I don't know. I wish I could say I was really optimistic, but there will be calls for it. But will there actually be legislation moved, or will there be an old school Madigan brick put on it? I don't know.
Well, listeners can follow all legislative activities at thecentersquare.com. Moving on to other news, Jim, you referenced the Republicans controlling Washington, D.C. now. President Donald Trump is in his second week in office, and one of his major campaign promises was to crack down on the border and the illegal border crossings, and also to round up and deport violent criminal illegal immigrants who are in the country. That is already well underway, including in Chicago and elsewhere in Cook County. Over the past week, we know federal agents have conducted raids in Chicago and the suburbs and arrested, I don't have an exact number right now because every day it grows. Governor Pritzker has said he supports deporting violent offender illegal immigrants, but protecting those in the country illegally who are not criminals. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson is opposing President Trump's efforts. It's starting to come to a head.
No question. And but again, when you look at the governor, he has said he supports the deportation of violent criminals, but sometimes even in the same statement, or certainly in the same press conference, he will immediately take aim at Trump, how this is inhumane, and so, listen to what I say or listen to what I do, right? So now here in Chicago, I'm in the middle of it, right? And it's been a media firestorm. It's been a social media firestorm. You would think people are, hiding, and some of the portrayals, people are hiding to avoid raids, and but what's really happening, you have an alleged child rapist from Thailand who was here illegally, who was captured, who was walking around until Tom Homan and Donald Trump got into office. He was walking around. He could have been walking down the street with any of our kids, and now he's gone, or he's on his way out. He's being deported. He was, I think Homan was actually there when this guy was brought into custody. So that's where the targeting is, and at this point, from the administration standpoint, you want to part of this. I think the reason you're seeing an immediate effort on the part of Immigrations and Customs Enforcement is to prevent more arrivals. I don't see any news about caravans on their way up through Central America coming from Venezuela now. Is that because Venezuela is suddenly economic paradise? No, I don't think so. Not with that government. But we don't see the caravans now. And we don't see all the video of people flooding into the country. So, all the headlines, there's, but the focus from the administration in Washington is definitely on violent criminals. Now, if you associate with violent criminals, you put yourself at risk of also being deported if you're here illegally. But I think your average person who's house cleaning, landscaping, driving trucks, etc., who's just living their life, paying their taxes, and otherwise not doing anything other than being here illegally, my sense is that they really don't. That's not going to be a focus of this administration. And yes, you have a lot of people, especially on the Republican side, who want everybody out. Well, but just logistically, how are you going to deport 11 million people in a couple of years? It's very difficult. The target is going to be the child predators, the human traffickers, gang members from the infamous Tren de Agua, the Venezuela, or some of the Mexican cartels. That's where this focus is going to be. To listen to a lot of the media here in Chicago, you're not necessarily getting that side of it. You'd think that it was the secret police from the KGB was going around and everyone was living in fear. But, my sense is that most people are just living their lives, and, there always has to be concern, because if you make a misstep, guess what? You're subject to being deported.
Jim, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of the news we talked about and more at thecentersquare.com.